The rain fell against the windows of the London townhouse like accusations, each drop a whisper of betrayal that Sebastian Ashford, Duke of Pemberton, had learned to ignore in the month since Celeste had shattered his heart and his faith in constancy. He stood in his study, a room grown dark with disuse and bitter memory, staring at the letter his mother had delivered that morning, with trembling hands and desperate eyes, a proposal of marriage, though proposal seemed too gentle a word for what amounted to a transaction, a remedy for scandal, a joining of two ruined souls who might yet salvage something resembling respectability from the wreckage of their separate disasters. Lady Eleanor Hartwell. The name tasted of ash in his mouth, for she was sister to Lord Edmund Hartwell, the very man who had stood as witness when Celeste had chosen another, who had smiled with barely concealed satisfaction as Sebastian's world had crumbled in a ballroom filled with pitying stares and gleeful whispers. His mother spoke of duty, of lineage, of the necessity of an heir, her words tumbling over one another in her anxiety to convince him. But Sebastian heard only the hollow echo of his own emptiness, the vast and terrible silence that had filled the spaces where love had once resided, foolish and bright and utterly destroyed. "She is ruined," his mother had said, as though this were recommendation rather than warning. "Her reputation quite beyond repair, and your father believes the alliance would settle certain difficulties between our families." Difficulties. What careful language the nobility employed to describe hatred, to dress enmity in silk and call it reconciliation. Eleanor Hartwell had been at the center of some scandal 2 years prior. The details remained deliberately vague in society's collective memory, whispered rather than spoken, suggested rather than confirmed. But Sebastian neither knew nor cared what sins she had committed, for in his present darkness all crimes seemed equal, all failures of character merely reflections of the fundamental duplicity he had learned resided in every human heart. He agreed to the marriage that very afternoon, his voice cold and flat as winter stone, watching his mother's relief war with her concern at his manner. But she was wise enough to accept his consent without questioning the spirit in which it was given. The wedding was arranged with unseemly haste, as though both families feared one party or the other might reconsider, might flee this loveless binding before the knot could be tied and the damage contained. When Eleanor arrived at the church, Sebastian saw her only in fragments, unable or unwilling to perceive her as a whole person, pale hands clutching a modest bouquet of white roses, a dress of ivory silk that seemed to drain rather than enhance her coloring, the eyes downcast throughout the ceremony, as though she too could not bear to witness what was being done. She spoke her vows in a voice barely above a whisper, each word falling like a stone into still water, disappearing without ripple or trace, and when the vicar pronounced them bound together until death should part them, Sebastian felt nothing but a grim satisfaction, that at least in this he was honest. He offered her nothing, promised her nothing, gave her only his name and the cold comfort of his indifference, which seemed punishment enough for being Edmund Hartwell's sister, for existing in a world that had proven itself unworthy of trust, for accepting without protest a marriage that benefited her far more than it could ever benefit him. The wedding breakfast was a cheerless affair held in the drawing-room of his mother's house, where pale winter light filtered through frost-etched windows and illuminated a table laden with delicacies that no one had appetite to enjoy. Least of all Sebastian, who sat rigid in his chair watching his new wife, his wife. What a strange and bitter word pick at her food with the mechanical movements of one who understood eating to be duty rather than pleasure. Eleanor spoke only when addressed directly, her replies brief and carefully neutral, neither warm nor cold, but something worse, utterly devoid of expectation, as though she had long ago learned not to hope for kindness from the world and had arranged her heart accordingly. His mother attempted conversation with desperate cheerfulness, speaking of Ashford Manor's beauty in spring, of the excellent housekeeper, Mrs. Davies, who would see to Eleanor's every comfort, of the rose gardens that had once been the estate's pride, and Eleanor received each piece of information with a small nod and a murmured thank you that revealed nothing of her thoughts, her feelings, her very self, which she seemed to hold at some great distance from this room and this moment and this man who was now her husband, yet had not spoken a single kind word to her since their meeting. When the ordeal of the meal finally concluded, Sebastian rose and addressed Eleanor for the first time since the ceremony, his voice formal and cold as the season itself. "You will depart for Ashford Manor this afternoon," he informed her, watching something flicker behind her eyes, fear perhaps, or relief. He could not tell and told himself he did not care. "I have business that requires my presence in London for the foreseeable future, and you will find the estate provides everything necessary for your comfort and occupation." She stood, her composure absolute, her hands folded before her in an attitude of perfect submission that somehow irritated him more than protest would have done. "As you wish, Your Grace," she replied, and the title sounded strange in her soft voice, a reminder of the chasm of rank and power that separated them, though in this moment it felt like something else, a wall she was building between them, brick by careful brick. He had expected arguments, tears, pleas for his company or at least for delay, but Eleanor asked for nothing, accepted his decree without the slightest objection, and this puzzled him despite his determination to remain indifferent to her in all things. They parted in the entrance hall an hour later, Sebastian bound for his townhouse and Eleanor for the country, their separate carriages waiting like symbols of the separation that would define their marriage. He watched her enter the coach with the same quiet dignity she had shown throughout the day, her back straight and her expression serene, though he thought he saw her hand tremble slightly as she gathered her skirts. Their eyes met for one brief moment before the door closed, and in hers he saw something he could not name, not anger, not sorrow exactly, but a kind of deep resignation that suggested she had expected nothing better from life, and was neither surprised nor particularly wounded by his coldness, which somehow made him feel more cruel than if she had wept. The carriage pulled away, bearing his wife toward a future of solitude in his ancestral home, while he returned to London and his bitterness. And Sebastian told himself he was satisfied with this arrangement, that he had punished them both appropriately, though as the winter afternoon darkened toward evening, he found himself standing at his study window, wondering what expression had crossed Eleanor's face when she was finally alone in that carriage, travelling toward an empty house and an emptier marriage, and why the question should trouble him at all. Ashford Manor rose from the Derbyshire landscape like a monument to faded glory, its pale stone walls and countless windows reflecting the cold March sky as Eleanor's carriage approached along the tree-lined drive, and she felt the weight of the place settle upon her shoulders even before she stepped from the coach into the biting wind that swept across the neglected grounds. This would be her home now, her prison or her sanctuary, depending upon how one chose to view a marriage without love or hope, and she had already determined to view it as the latter, for she had learned long ago that survival required accepting what could not be changed and finding small mercies where larger ones were denied. Mrs. Davies, the housekeeper, greeted her with barely concealed curiosity and something that might have been pity, showing her through rooms that seemed designed to dwarf and diminish human warmth, each chamber vast and elegantly appointed, yet somehow lifeless, as though the house itself had forgotten the sound of laughter and genuine affection, which perhaps it had, for Sebastian clearly visited rarely, and his parents were long deceased, leaving only servants to maintain a shell of former grandeur. Eleanor settled into her duties with quiet determination, rising early to meet with Mrs. Davies about household matters, reviewing accounts that had been somewhat neglected, making small decisions about repairs and supplies that the housekeeper seemed grateful to share, and though the servants watched her with wary eyes at first, she treated them with unfailing courtesy and kindness, remembering names, asking after sick relatives, thanking them for their service, small gestures that cost her nothing but seemed to mean everything to people accustomed to being invisible to their betters. Sebastian arrived on the fourth day, his presence announced by the sound of hooves on gravel and the sudden tension that rippled through the household staff, and Eleanor received him in the drawing-room, with her hands folded and her expression carefully neutral, prepared for coldness and finding it in abundance, in his clipped greeting, and the way his eyes seemed to look through her rather than at her, as though she were merely another piece of furniture to be noted and dismissed. He stayed 3 days, spending most of his time in the study with estate ledgers and correspondence, taking his meals alone despite Eleanor's quiet suggestion that they might dine together, and on the second afternoon she saw him from her window standing at the edge of the gardens that sprawled behind the house, once magnificent, but now overgrown and wild, his hands clasped behind his back, and his shoulders rigid with some emotion. She could not name anger, perhaps, or grief, or simply the bitter satisfaction of a man who had successfully exiled everything that might touch his heart. On the third day, Eleanor ventured into those same gardens with pruning shears borrowed from the groundskeeper, drawn by some instinct toward growing things and the honest labor of cultivation, and she was kneeling among the tangled roses, her hands already scratched and dirty, when she felt rather than saw Sebastian watching from the terrace above, his gaze heavy with what she thought might be disdain, though she could not be certain and told herself it did not matter, that she tended these gardens for herself and not for his approval, though some small traitorous part of her heart wished he might see in this gesture something other than manipulation or performance. He departed the next morning without farewell, his carriage disappearing down the drive as dawn broke pale and cold over the Derbyshire hills, and Eleanor stood at her bedroom window watching him go, wondering if weeks or months might pass before she saw her husband again, and finding herself almost relieved by his absence, even as some deeper part of her mourned the loneliness of this vast house and this hollow marriage, this punishment they both endured for crimes neither had fully committed, though the world had judged them guilty all the same. London in spring should have brought renewal, but Sebastian found only the stale rhythms of club life and empty social gatherings, his days bleeding into one another with tedious sameness as he avoided his townhouse study, where letters from Ashford Manor accumulated on his desk, unopened and reproachful in their very existence, for he could not bring himself to read Eleanor's careful reports about tenant concerns and roof repairs and the condition of the south pasture. These mundane details of a life he had exiled her to live alone, while he nursed his bitterness among the gossips and schemers of town. It was at Lady Pemberton's musicale that he first heard Eleanor's name spoken in his presence, two matrons whispering behind their fans with that particular relish society reserved for fallen women, and though he told himself he did not care what was said about his wife, he found himself listening with unwanted attention as they recounted the scandal of 3 years past, how Eleanor Hartwell had deliberately seduced Lord Rothmore away from his intended bride, carrying on a shameless affair that destroyed poor Miss Catherine Winter's engagement and drove the young woman to retire to the country in humiliation, how Eleanor had shown no remorse even when confronted, and how only her brother's influence had prevented complete social annihilation, though her reputation never recovered, and no decent man would have her until the Duke of Ashford, recently jilted himself, agreed to the match out of spite or madness or both. Sebastian's hands clenched around his wineglass as he absorbed these details, his hatred for Eleanor crystallizing into something harder and colder than before, for if the whispers were true, and why should they not be, spoken so confidently by women who had witnessed the events themselves, then she was exactly as duplicitous and heartless as her brother, a creature who destroyed others' happiness without conscience, and he felt vindicated in his cruelty toward her, justified in leaving her isolated at Ashford Manor, where she could harm no one else with her machinations. The weeks passed slowly, spring surrendering to summer's heat, and then to autumn's melancholy, and still the letters came from Derbyshire, with their neat handwriting and careful accounting of estate business. The harvest had been good. The new tenants in the West Cottage were settling well. Mrs. Davies sent her regards and hoped his Grace was in good health, and Sebastian never once took pen in hand to respond, telling himself that silence was answer enough, that Eleanor deserved nothing from him, not even the courtesy of acknowledgement, though sometimes late at night when wine loosened the tight control he maintained over his thoughts, he wondered what she did in that vast house with no company but servants, whether she was lonely or content, whether she thought of him at all or had simply accepted his absence as she seemed to accept everything else, with that maddening composure that suggested either supreme indifference or something else entirely, something he could not name and refused to examine. Autumn arrived with its usual pageant of gold and crimson, and Sebastian stood at his study window, watching leaves scatter across the London street below, feeling an inexplicable melancholy settle over him like the season itself, a sense of something lost or wasted or simply passing beyond recall. And he thought, despite himself, of Ashford Manor in autumn, how beautiful the grounds must be with the ancient oaks turning colour and the evening light slanting across the Derbyshire hills, and whether Eleanor walked those paths alone, watching the same sunset he now observed from this different world, this separate existence they maintained, as though they were not bound by law and church, and vows neither had wanted but both were condemned to honour. Business concerns regarding timber rights and a disputed boundary with a neighboring estate forced Sebastian's return to Ashford Manor in late October, weeks earlier than he had vaguely planned, and he arrived with reluctance heavy in his chest, expecting to find the house as cold and lifeless as he had left it, a fitting monument to their mutual exile and misery. But as his carriage rounded the final bend in the drive, he felt something shift in the air around him, a quality of light or warmth that seemed impossible given the season and his memories of this place. The gardens that had been wild and overgrown now showed careful tending, the roses pruned and mulched for winter, the pathways cleared of encroaching weeds, the fountain in the center courtyard flowing again after years of neglect, its gentle splash audible even from the drive. And as he stepped from the carriage, he noticed smoke rising from not just the main chimneys, but from the servants' quarters as well, suggesting a household fully inhabited rather than merely maintained, and despite himself he felt a flicker of something that might have been curiosity or confusion, or perhaps the first tremor of an emotion he was not yet prepared to name. Eleanor appeared in the doorway as he approached, her figure framed by the warm light spilling from the entrance hall, and she descended the steps with that same quiet grace he remembered from their wedding day, her dress simple but elegant, her hair arranged with care, her hands folded before her in a posture that suggested welcome without presumption, and when she curtsied and greeted him with, "Your Grace, we are honored by your presence." Her voice carried no reproach for his months of absence, no bitterness for his silence, only a gentle courtesy that somehow made him feel more ashamed than any accusation could have done. He responded with stiff formality, inquiring about the estate matters that had brought him here, and she answered with precise knowledge of boundaries and contracts and timber values, clearly having educated herself thoroughly in his absence. And as they walked together toward the study, he became aware of changes everywhere, fresh flowers in the hallway despite the season, paintings cleaned and rehung, windows that sparkled with recent washing, the scent of beeswax and lavender rather than dust and abandonment. And through an open doorway he glimpsed servants setting the dining table with care, their movements efficient but unhurried, their faces showing none of the dour resignation he remembered from his last visit. Mrs. Davies appeared to report that his chambers were prepared, and the warmth in her greeting of Eleanor, the way she sought her mistress's eye for approval before speaking to him, told Sebastian more clearly than words that something fundamental had shifted in this household, that Eleanor had somehow won the servants' loyalty and affection in the months of his absence, and he found himself both impressed and oddly unsettled by this evidence of her capability, her quiet strength, for it contradicted the image he had constructed of her as a manipulative creature deserving of punishment and isolation. That evening at dinner, served in the smaller family dining room rather than the formal hall, Eleanor maintained conversation about estate matters with informed intelligence, asking his opinion on improvements she had considered, deferring to his authority while making clear she had already given these questions considerable thought, and Sebastian found himself responding with more engagement than he had intended, drawn despite himself into discussion of crop rotation and tenant welfare, and when he made some comment about the transformed gardens, she simply said, "The roses needed attention, and I found the work restorative," her eyes meeting his with that same unfathomable calm that had always both frustrated and intrigued him, and he realized with uncomfortable clarity that whatever punishment he had intended to inflict by leaving her here, she had somehow turned this exile into something else entirely, something that looked almost like contentment, and her unchanged gentleness toward his coldness, her refusal to be diminished by his cruelty, disconcerted him more than any tears or recriminations ever could have done. Sebastian found sleep elusive that first night back at Ashford Manor, his mind restless with observations that refused to settle into the neat categories of judgment he had constructed, and when he finally abandoned his bed in the grey hours before dawn, he wandered the silent corridors until he found himself drawn to the library by the soft glow of candlelight spilling beneath its door, and upon entering he discovered Eleanor curled in the window seat with a book, her profile illuminated by the pale light of approaching morning, her hair loose around her shoulders in a way he had never seen, and something about the unguarded quality of her posture, the way she bit her lower lip in concentration, made him hesitate in the doorway like an intruder upon a private moment. Though this was his own house and she merely his unwanted wife, she looked up at his presence, startled but not displeased, and he found himself making some awkward comment about early rising, to which she replied with gentle humor that she had always preferred dawn's quiet to any other hour, and as he moved deeper into the room, selecting a book at random to justify his presence, he noticed details he had somehow missed before. The way her hands, though elegant and fine-boned, bore the calluses and slight roughness of someone who worked with soil and thorns, the ink stains on her fingers suggesting she did more than simply dictate correspondence to secretaries, the simple practicality of her morning dress, chosen for comfort rather than display, and these small evidences of her actual life, the one she lived when he was not there to observe and judge, unsettled something in his chest that felt uncomfortably like shame. The days that followed brought more such observations, unbidden and unwanted but impossible to ignore, for he found himself watching her despite his intentions to maintain cold distance, noting how she moved through the house with quiet purpose, how she paused to speak kindly to old Mrs. Davies about her rheumatism and asked young Thomas the footman about his mother's illness, how she never demanded service but requested it with a courtesy that made the servants eager to please her, and Sebastian realized with growing discomfort that Eleanor had somehow become the heart of this household in his absence, the center around which daily life organized itself, and that his own presence was the disruption rather than the restoration of natural order. He watched her in the gardens one afternoon, kneeling in the dirt to examine the root system of a struggling rose bush, her skirts muddy and her face concentrated, speaking softly to the elderly groundskeeper about soil composition and drainage, with a knowledge that came from genuine interest rather than mere estate management. And when she stood and noticed Sebastian observing from the terrace, she did not preen or pose, but simply nodded acknowledgement before returning her attention to the roses. And this lack of performance, this absence of any attempt to manipulate his opinion or win his favor, confused him more than calculated seduction ever could have done. What disturbed him most was her silence, not the sullen silence of resentment or the pointed silence of reproach, but a quality of peace that seemed to emanate from some inner stillness he could not comprehend, for she never complained about her isolation, never demanded his attention or company, never even asked why he had abandoned her here for months without a word, and her contentment in his absence, her apparent lack of need for him or anyone else, struck him as either supreme indifference or something far more mysterious, a self-sufficiency that suggested depths he had never imagined, and he found himself wanting to crack that composure, to provoke some reaction that would confirm his right to hate her, yet also found himself increasingly fascinated by the woman who could be so gravely wronged, yet maintain such gentle dignity. And these contradictory impulses warred within him as he watched her read in the library at dawn, attend her gardens in the afternoon, and sit quietly at dinner, speaking only when spoken to, her very peacefulness becoming a kind of reproach to his own turbulent bitterness, though she never intended it as such, and Sebastian began to realize with growing unease that his interest in Eleanor was transforming from the cold scrutiny of an enemy to something altogether more dangerous, something he was not yet prepared to acknowledge or name. The tension that had been building between them for days finally erupted on the 5th evening of Sebastian's stay, during what had begun as another quiet dinner in the family dining room, the air thick with unspoken words and the weight of observations neither acknowledged, and Sebastian, disturbed by his own growing fascination with Eleanor and seeking perhaps to restore the comfortable certainty of his hatred, found himself remarking with calculated cruelty that it must be pleasant for her to play mistress of such a grand estate, given that her scandal had surely destroyed any hope she might have harbored of finding a respectable situation, and the words hung in the air between them, like poison, his voice carrying that particular edge of contempt he had perfected in London drawing rooms, designed to wound and diminish, and for the first time since their wedding day, Eleanor's careful composure fractured visibly before him. He saw it happen in increments that felt both instantaneous and achingly slow, the way her hand trembled slightly as she set down her wineglass, the sudden rigidity in her spine and the color draining from her already pale face. But most devastating was what he glimpsed in her eyes in that unguarded moment, a flash of such raw pain that it struck him like a physical blow, not the pain of pride wounded or vanity offended, but something far deeper and more terrible, the pain of someone who had endured this particular cruelty so many times that each new instance reopened old wounds rather than creating fresh ones. And in her eyes he saw not anger or indignation, but a kind of weary recognition, as if she had known all along that his tentative softening toward her would eventually give way to this, the inevitable reassertion of his judgment and contempt. She rose from her chair with a grace that seemed to cost her considerable effort, her movements careful and contained, as though she feared falling apart if she relaxed her rigid control even slightly, and when she spoke her voice was barely above a whisper, carrying none of its usual gentle warmth, but rather a hollow quality that suggested something vital had been extinguished within her. "Forgive me, Your Grace, I find I am unwell this evening," she managed, the formal address a retreat into the safety of protocol, and she curtsied with mechanical precision before turning toward the door, and Sebastian sat frozen in his chair, watching her straight back and measured steps, and felt something twist painfully in his chest, a sensation entirely unfamiliar and deeply unwelcome, something that might have been guilt or regret or the first stirring of genuine remorse, though he fought against naming it even as it spread through him like ice water in his veins. He remained at the table long after she had gone, the food growing cold before him, the candles burning lower, wrestling with emotions he could not fully comprehend, telling himself that she deserved his contempt, that her scandal justified any cruelty he might inflict, yet finding these familiar arguments suddenly hollow and unconvincing in the face of what he had seen in her eyes, and when he finally rose and walked through the darkened house, he found himself drawn to the windows overlooking the garden, and there in the moonlight he saw her, a solitary figure among the roses she had so carefully tended, her shoulders shaking with sobs she had clearly held back during their dinner, her hands covering her face in a gesture of such complete devastation that something fundamental shifted within him, some wall he had built around his heart, developing its first hairline crack, and though he did not yet understand why her tears should affect him so profoundly when he had intended to make her suffer, he could not deny the truth of what he felt, watching her weep alone in the garden, that in wounding her, he had somehow wounded himself as well, and that the satisfaction he had expected to feel at breaking her composure had transformed into something that tasted remarkably like shame. The storm arrived 3 days after the incident in the garden, sweeping across the countryside with the fury of early autumn tempests, bringing sheets of rain that lashed against the windows and wind that howled through the eaves like something wild and desperate, seeking shelter, and Sebastian found himself trapped indoors with Eleanor in a way that felt both accidental and somehow inevitable, as though fate had conspired to force upon them a proximity neither had sought yet both perhaps needed. And when dinner ended in the usual uncomfortable silence, he retreated to the library, as had become his habit, surprised to find Eleanor already there, curled in her customary window seat with a book, the firelight casting shadows across her face that made her seem both younger and infinitely older than her years. She looked up at his entrance with an expression of wary resignation, as though bracing herself for another cutting remark, and something about that guarded look, the way she had learned to anticipate cruelty from him, made Sebastian feel a fresh wave of that unfamiliar shame, and instead of retreating or attacking, he found himself moving to the sideboard where Brandy waited, pouring 2 glasses with hands that trembled slightly, and crossing to offer her one in what felt like a tentative gesture towards something he could not yet name, perhaps truce, or perhaps merely acknowledgement of the strange tension that had been building between them, like the atmospheric pressure before the storm. Eleanor accepted the glass with visible surprise, her fingers careful not to touch his as she took it, and they sat in silence for a long moment, and the only sounds the crackling fire and the rain beating against the windows, until Sebastian, emboldened by the brandy warming his throat and the strange intimacy created by the storm's isolation, found himself asking the question that had haunted him since witnessing her tears in the garden: why had she accepted this marriage, this punishment disguised as duty, when surely she could have refused, fled to distant relations, found some other path than this living imprisonment with a man who despised her? Eleanor was quiet so long he thought she might not answer, her eyes fixed on the amber liquid in her glass, as though it might contain some script for this unexpected conversation, and when she finally spoke, her voice was low and careful, each word chosen with the precision of someone navigating treacherous ground, and she said that duty was perhaps a simpler answer than the truth, and that family sometimes demanded sacrifices that made little sense to those outside the situation, that she had learned long ago that her own desires mattered less than the greater good, whatever that might mean. And there was something in the way she spoke, a hidden depth beneath the surface politeness, that suggested layers of meaning Sebastian could not quite grasp. Secrets embedded in her careful phrasing like messages written in invisible ink. He pressed her gently, made reckless by wine and the strange confessional atmosphere the storm had created, asking what she could possibly owe her family that would justify this exile and this marriage to a man who had made no secret of his contempt. And Eleanor's composure wavered again as it had at dinner days before, but this time instead of fleeing she met his eyes directly, and he saw in them such complicated emotion, pain and defiance, and something that might have been a terrible tenderness, that his breath caught in his throat. And she said simply that sometimes protecting those we care about requires sacrifices others cannot understand, that reputation was a small price to pay for preventing greater harm. And though her words were still guarded, still careful, Sebastian heard in them the suggestion of some larger truth, some mystery that connected her scandal and her willing acceptance of this marriage in ways he had never considered, and the thought that there might be more to her story than the simple narrative of disgrace and punishment unsettled everything he thought he knew. The conversation ended abruptly when thunder crashed so close it shook the windows, making Eleanor startle, and Sebastian found himself moving toward her instinctively, some protective impulse overriding his habitual coldness, but she recovered quickly, setting down her glass and murmuring something about retiring, and as she moved past him toward the door, he caught the scent of lavender and rain and felt the brush of her sleeve against his arm. And these small physical details struck him with unexpected force, reminding him that she was not merely a symbol of his enemy or a repository for his bitterness, but a woman, flesh and blood and breath, real and present, and somehow unknowable, despite their forced proximity. And as the door closed behind her, Sebastian stood alone in the firelight, understanding that something had shifted between them this night. Some barrier had thinned, if not broken, and that he could no longer maintain the comfortable certainty of his hatred when questions had begun multiplying in the spaces where his judgments used to be. Lord Hartwell arrived without warning on a grey afternoon, when mist clung to the grounds like secrets refusing to dissipate, his carriage thundering up the drive with an urgency that sent servants scattering and brought Sebastian from his study with a scowl already darkening his features, for of all the people who might appear at Ashford Manor, Eleanor's brother was perhaps the least welcome, the man whose machinations Sebastian blamed for much of his current misery, whose very name carried the bitter taste of betrayal and ruined trust. And as Sebastian watched the footman help Hartwell from the carriage, he braced himself for confrontation, for demands or accusations, or whatever game the man had come to play. But what he did not expect was his own reaction when Eleanor appeared in the entrance hall, summoned by the commotion, and he saw her face drain of color at the sight of her brother, saw something that looked remarkably like fear flash across her features before she composed herself with visible effort. Hartwell embraced her with a familiarity that made Sebastian's jaw tighten, speaking of family duty and concern for her welfare in tones that rang false to Sebastian's ears. And throughout the strained greetings and the awkward procession to the drawing room, Sebastian found himself watching Eleanor with new attention, noting how she held herself rigid in her brother's presence, how she positioned herself subtly closer to Sebastian than to Hartwell, how her responses to her brother's questions were even more guarded than her usual careful speech, as though she were navigating particularly dangerous waters and feared saying anything that might capsize the fragile boat of civility. The visit stretched through tea and into early evening, Hartwell making conversation that seemed designed to remind Sebastian of old grievances, mentioning mutual acquaintances from London, touching lightly on the scandal that had ruined Eleanor's reputation with a casualness that made her flinch. And through it all, Sebastian felt a growing wrongness about the entire situation, a sense that something fundamental did not align with his assumptions about Eleanor's relationship with her family. And when Hartwell suggested speaking privately with his sister, Eleanor's hand trembled so violently that tea sloshed over the rim of her cup, and without thinking, Sebastian found himself saying coldly that anything Lord Hartwell wished to discuss with the Duchess could be said in her husband's presence, surprising himself with the protectiveness in his own voice, the way he claimed Eleanor as his in that moment, not as property, but as someone under his guardianship, someone he would shield from whatever threat Hartwell might represent. The tension in the room became almost unbearable, Hartwell's eyes narrowing as he studied Sebastian with what might have been calculation or concern, and Eleanor sat frozen between them, her face pale as parchment, her breathing shallow, and Sebastian realized with a jolt that she was not seeking her brother's protection or comfort, but rather seemed to be protecting Sebastian from him, positioning her slight form as though to intercept whatever blow might fall, and this realization struck him with the force of revelation, upending yet another assumption about the woman he had married, suggesting depths and complications to her story that he had never imagined in all his bitter certainty about her guilt and unworthiness. When Hartwell finally departed as darkness fell, making vague promises to call again soon that sounded more like threats than courtesies, Eleanor remained standing in the entrance hall long after the carriage disappeared down the drive, her arms wrapped around herself as though she were cold, despite the warmth of the fires burning throughout the house, and when Sebastian approached her carefully, uncertain what to say or do, she turned to him with eyes that held such relief and gratitude that it took his breath away. And she whispered simply, "Thank you for not leaving me alone with him." And in those words, Sebastian heard confirmation of something he had begun to suspect, that Eleanor's relationship with her brother was not one of affection and alliance, but something far more complex and troubling, and that perhaps the enemy he had believed her to be in league with was actually someone from whom she herself needed protection, and this possibility, barely formed and still frightening in its implications, lodged in his mind like a seed that would inevitably grow into questions he could no longer avoid asking, doubts about everything he thought he knew, not just about Eleanor, but about the entire web of betrayal and scandal that had brought them to this strange marriage, and this punishment that was beginning to feel less like justice and more like mystery. The days following Hartwell's departure passed in uneasy quiet, Sebastian finding himself unable to shake the strange protectiveness he had felt toward Eleanor or the questions her fear of her own brother had raised, and seeking distraction from these uncomfortable thoughts, he retreated to his study, where estate business waited, sorting through correspondence and accounts that had accumulated during his absence from London, but it was while searching for a particular contract in the lower desk drawer that his hand brushed against a bundle of letters he had forgotten, correspondence from years past that he had shoved away after his broken engagement, too painful to destroy yet too bitter to reread, and now something compelled him to pull them out, to unfold pages yellowed slightly with time, and as he began reading through the letters exchanged between himself and his former fiancée, between various society acquaintances, discussing the scandal that had destroyed his planned marriage, Eleanor's name leaped from the pages with a frequency that made his pulse quicken, references to Lady Eleanor Hartwell's involvement in exposing the affair, mentions of her presence at crucial moments, suggestions that she had deliberately sabotaged his happiness out of some alliance with her brother, and Sebastian felt his old hatred reigniting like embers stirred to flame, the anger he had been questioning suddenly given fresh fuel by these written proofs of her guilt, except that as he read more carefully, forcing himself to note dates and sequences rather than simply absorbing accusations, inconsistencies began emerging like cracks in a smooth surface. Letters placing Eleanor in London, when other correspondence clearly showed she had been in Bath, references to conversations she supposedly had on dates, when Sebastian himself could remember seeing her at entirely different social functions, and these discrepancies troubled him, even as part of him wanted to ignore them, wanted to cling to the simple narrative of betrayal, rather than face the possibility that nothing was as it seemed. He confronted Eleanor that evening after dinner, the letters clutched in his hand like weapons, or perhaps evidence in some trial whose verdict he could not predict, finding her in the music room, where she sometimes played quiet melodies on the pianoforte when she thought no one would hear, and the sight of her there in the lamplight, her fingers stilled on the keys as she turned to face him with that familiar expression of wary resignation, should have softened his anger. But instead it fueled it, because he wanted answers, needed to understand why these letters existed and what truth they contained, and he demanded she explain her role in his broken engagement, spreading the correspondence before her like accusations made manifest, watching her face as she read through them with fingers that trembled slightly, and when she finally looked up at him, her eyes held such complicated sorrow that it struck him like a physical blow, But she offered no defense, no explanation, no plea for understanding, simply said in a voice barely above a whisper, "Believe what you will, Your Grace. I have learned that the truth rarely matters when minds are already decided," and her resignation in that moment, her refusal to fight for her own innocence or to rail against his accusations, haunted Sebastian in ways her tears or anger never could have done, because there was something in her acceptance of his hatred that spoke of a weariness so deep it seemed to have settled into her very bones. And as she rose from the pianoforte and left the room with the dignity of someone walking to an execution already survived countless times before, Sebastian stood among the scattered letters, feeling not triumphant in his righteous anger, but hollow and uncertain, the inconsistencies he had noticed earlier seeming to grow larger in his mind, and he found himself wondering for the first time whether the woman he had married as punishment might actually be the victim of some larger injustice. He had been too blinded by his own pain to recognize, and this possibility, barely formed, yet impossible now to dismiss, lodged in his consciousness like a splinter, working its way deeper, painful and insistent, and demanding attention he could no longer refuse to give. The fever came upon Eleanor in the night like a thief stealing her strength, and when the housekeeper found her the next morning unable to rise from her bed, her skin burning with heat that seemed to radiate from some inner furnace, Sebastian was summoned from his study, where he had spent a sleepless night wrestling with the doubts Eleanor's resignation had planted in his mind, and the sight of her lying so still and pale against the pillows, her usual quiet composure replaced by the helpless vulnerability of illness, struck him with unexpected force, sending him immediately for the physician, despite the early hour and the distance the doctor would need to travel from the village. And in the hours while they waited, Sebastian found himself unable to leave Eleanor's side, sitting in the chair beside her bed with a vigilance that surprised the servants who brought cool water and fresh linens, watching as she drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes peaceful and sometimes restless, her fever climbing as the day wore on, until she began to murmur words that made no sense, fragments of sentences that seemed pulled from dreams or memories, and it was these delirious utterances that began to chip away at the foundation of Sebastian's certainty about her guilt. For in her fever, she spoke of protecting someone, whispered apologies that seemed directed at him, though she did not say his name, murmured something about terrible choices and sacrifices that had to be made, and once, clearly enough that it made Sebastian lean closer to catch every word, she whispered, "I could not let them destroy him, even if he would hate me forever for what I had to do." And these words, spoken without guile or calculation by a woman too ill to dissemble, lodged in Sebastian's heart like arrows finding their mark. And when the physician finally arrived in late afternoon, examining Eleanor with practiced efficiency, before declaring that she had overtaxed her constitution and that her system had never fully recovered from some previous strain, mentioning almost casually that ladies of delicate health often suffered lingering effects from periods of extreme stress, Sebastian found himself asking what stress the doctor meant, and the elderly physician, who had known Eleanor's family for years, spoke matter-of-factly about that terrible year when she had been caught up in some London scandal, how the shame and isolation had nearly broken her health entirely, how she had spent months confined to her rooms, and Sebastian listened with growing horror as the physician described symptoms that spoke not of a manipulative schemer celebrating her successful destruction of another's happiness, but of a woman suffering under some unbearable burden. And as the doctor mixed medicines and gave instructions for Eleanor's care, Sebastian sat frozen by the bedside, watching her restless sleep, listening to her fevered murmurs, and feeling the edifice of his hatred crumbling like a wall undermined by persistent water. And when the physician departed with promises to return the next day, Sebastian remained where he was, unable to leave despite the lateness of the hour, and through the long night he kept vigil beside his wife, bathing her forehead with cool cloths when the fever spiked, holding her hand when nightmares made her cry out, and listening to every word she spoke in her delirium, each fragment adding to the picture forming in his mind of a woman who had suffered greatly for reasons he did not yet understand, a woman whose resignation and silence might not be guilt at all, but rather the exhaustion of someone who had already paid too high a price for sins she perhaps had never committed. And as dawn broke pale and cold through the bedroom windows, Sebastian looked at Eleanor's sleeping face, still flushed with fever but peaceful now, and knew with sudden certainty that he had been terribly, catastrophically wrong about her, though he did not yet know the full truth of how wrong or why, only that the punishment he had inflicted on this innocent woman was a cruelty he could barely comprehend, and the weight of that realization settled on his shoulders like a mantle of lead, heavy with implications he would have to face when she recovered. If she recovered, and that terrible if sent him reaching for her hand again, holding it as though he could anchor her to life through sheer force of will, this woman he had married to punish, but who seemed instead to have been punished enough for both of them. Eleanor's recovery came slowly, like spring reluctant to displace winter, the fever breaking on the third day but leaving her weak and pale, confined to her bed for nearly a week while her strength gradually returned, and through all of it, Sebastian remained closer than propriety or their history would have suggested, finding excuses to check on her recovery, bringing books from the library he thought might interest her, sitting in the chair by her window while she rested. And this unexpected attentiveness confused Eleanor almost as much as it confused Sebastian himself, for neither could quite name what had shifted between them during those fever-dark days, only that some barrier had crumbled, leaving them tentative and uncertain in unfamiliar territory, and their conversations, which had always been either coldly formal or weighted with unspoken tensions, began to flow more naturally, less guarded, as though Eleanor's illness had given them permission to speak as two people rather than as punishment giver and punished. On the afternoon, Eleanor was finally strong enough to sit in the small parlor adjoining her bedroom. Sebastian brought tea himself, rather than summoning a servant, and they sat together in the pale sunlight, streaming through lace curtains, the silence between them no longer hostile but almost companionable, and Eleanor, perhaps emboldened by weakness, or perhaps simply tired of the careful distance they had maintained, began speaking of her love for Ashford Manor, how the estate had become a sanctuary for her in ways she had not expected, how she had found peace in the gardens and the quiet rhythms of country life. And Sebastian listened with an attention that was new, really listened rather than waiting to find fault or dismiss her words, and he heard in her descriptions of solitude not the contentment of someone who preferred isolation, but the resigned acceptance of someone who had learned to make peace with loneliness, and something in this realization made him share in return, tentatively at first and then with growing ease, memories of his mother who had loved these same gardens, who had taught him the names of flowers and shown him how to coax beauty from reluctant soil, and Eleanor's face softened as he spoke, her eyes brightening with interest and something that might have been tenderness, and she asked gentle questions that drew out more memories, and Sebastian found himself speaking of things he had not voiced in years, the grief of losing his mother young, the pressure of becoming duke before he felt ready, the loneliness of carrying a title that set him apart, even from those who claimed friendship, and in sharing these pieces of himself, he felt something loosening in his chest, some tightness he had carried so long he had forgotten it was there. The days that followed settled into a new pattern, Sebastian finding reasons to remain at the manor rather than returning to London, joining Eleanor for meals that stretched longer as their conversations deepened, walking with her through the recovering gardens where autumn was painting the leaves in shades of amber and gold, and in these walks their proximity increased incrementally, their shoulders nearly touching as they examined a late-blooming rose, hands brushing accidentally when both reached to open a gate, lingering glances caught and held for moments that stretched like honey in sunlight, and neither acknowledged these small intimacies directly, but both felt them, the air between them charged with possibilities neither quite dared to name. And Sebastian noticed things he had been too angry to see before, the grace in Eleanor's movements, despite her lingering weakness, the intelligence in her observations about the estate and the world beyond it, the kindness that seemed as natural to her as breathing, and he found himself watching her when she was absorbed in reading or tending to correspondence, studying the curve of her cheek in lamplight, the way her fingers moved across pages, the small smile that sometimes touched her lips when she thought herself unobserved. And these observations stirred something in him that felt dangerously close to admiration, perhaps even the first fragile shoots of something deeper, though he could not yet bring himself to examine that possibility too closely, still weighted by the guilt of how he had treated her and the growing suspicion that everything he had believed about her was built on foundations of sand and lies. Sebastian found Eleanor in the garden as twilight descended like a silk veil over Ashford Manor, the sky painted in shades of amber and rose that seemed to set the world ablaze with gentle fire, and she stood among the late-blooming roses she had coaxed back to life, her figure silhouetted against the dying light in a way that made his breath catch unexpectedly in his chest. And something in that golden hour, in the way the fading sun caught the copper threads in her dark hair and softened the lines of weariness that lingered from her illness, gave him a courage he had not possessed before, a sudden, desperate need to understand the woman he had married in anger and was only now beginning to truly see, and he approached quietly across the gravel path, his footsteps announcing his presence, and when she turned to face him, there was surprise in her eyes, but no fear, only a kind of patient, waiting as though she had known this moment would come eventually. And Sebastian stopped a few paces away, close enough to see the way the twilight reflected in her eyes, close enough to notice the slight trembling in her hands as she lowered the garden shears she had been holding. And for a long moment neither spoke, the air between them heavy with all the words they had not said, all the questions that had accumulated like snow on winter branches. And finally Sebastian broke the silence with a gentleness that felt foreign on his tongue, asking not accusingly but with genuine desire to understand why she had accepted this marriage, what had truly happened in that terrible year everyone whispered about, what burden she carried with such quiet resignation. And Eleanor's composure, which had remained intact through his coldness and his cruelty, through illness and isolation, wavered now in the face of his unexpected tenderness, her eyes filling with tears that caught the fading light like diamonds, and she turned slightly away as though to hide this vulnerability. Her voice, when she finally spoke, barely above a whisper, as she confessed that she had been so very lonely, that the choices she had made were for reasons she could not fully explain, that sometimes protecting those we care for requires sacrifices that others can never understand or forgive, and there was such pain in her words, such depths of suffering carefully concealed beneath years of practiced composure, that Sebastian felt something crack open in his chest, and some barrier he had constructed around his heart to protect himself from further betrayal. And he took a step closer, drawn by an impulse he could not name, wanting desperately to ease the hurt he saw in her face, to understand the mystery of this woman who had transformed his cold estate into a home, who had endured his punishment with such grace, who spoke now of protecting people with a conviction that suggested she knew intimately the cost of such protection. And Eleanor continued speaking in fragments, her words tumbling out as though a dam had broken, speaking of choices made in darkness, of reputations sacrificed for purposes she could not reveal, of loving from a distance, someone who would never know or return that love. And though she did not say his name, Sebastian understood with sudden clarity that she spoke of him, that somehow in ways he did not yet comprehend, she had made her terrible choices to protect him, and this realization moved him so profoundly that he reached out without thinking, his hand extending toward hers, fingers almost touching before he caught himself and stopped, the gesture hanging incomplete in the air between them, like a question waiting for an answer. And Eleanor looked at his outstretched hand and then at his face, seeing there something that made fresh tears spill down her cheeks, and the twilight deepened around them, wrapping them in purple shadows, while the last light died on the horizon. And in that suspended moment Sebastian understood that he stood at a threshold, that whatever he did next would determine the course of both their lives, and though he did not yet know the full truth of Eleanor's past, he knew with certainty that she deserved better than the punishment he had inflicted, deserved tenderness and understanding and perhaps even love, and the weight of his own cruelty pressed down on him like a physical force as he stood there in the gathering darkness, his hand still extended toward his wife, close enough to touch but not quite touching, while the garden held its breath around them and waited. The garden scene haunted Sebastian through the sleepless night that followed, Eleanor's words echoing in his mind with such persistence that by dawn he knew he could no longer continue in ignorance, could no longer accept the convenient narrative he had constructed to justify his cruelty. And so he departed for London that very morning with barely a word to Eleanor beyond a terse explanation of urgent business, though in truth the only urgency was the desperate need gnawing at his conscience, the growing certainty that he had built his hatred on foundations he had never properly examined. And the journey to London felt interminable, each mile weighted with impatience and a fear he could not quite name, the fear perhaps that investigating too deeply would confirm his worst assumptions about Eleanor, or worse still, reveal truths that would make his treatment of her utterly unforgivable, and upon reaching his townhouse he wasted no time on rest or refreshment, but immediately began the work of investigation, pulling out old correspondence and society columns from that terrible season, 3 years past, when his engagement had ended in such spectacular public humiliation, and as he read through the accounts with fresh eyes, no longer blinded by hurt pride and rage, inconsistencies began emerging like cracks in fine porcelain, small at first but growing more pronounced the deeper he looked, for the timeline that society had accepted so readily simply did not align with known facts. Eleanor's presence at certain events, documented in ways that contradicted the accusations against her, and Sebastian found himself making discreet inquiries among old acquaintances, framing his questions carefully to avoid arousing suspicion, speaking to men who had been present at the house party where the scandal had allegedly occurred, and their accounts varied in troubling ways, some insisting Eleanor had been the instigator, while others seemed uncertain, their memories curiously vague when pressed for specific details, and one elderly viscount who had been deep in his cups admitted he had heard the story second-hand, had not actually witnessed anything himself, but had repeated the gossip because everyone else was saying it, and this admission sent a chill through Sebastian's blood because it suggested how easily reputation could be destroyed by rumor, how readily society accepted scandal without demanding proof, and he pressed harder in his investigations, visiting the offices of solicitors who had handled various legal matters that season, examining records of financial transactions and property transfers, and here he found evidence more concrete and more damning. Payments made from accounts controlled by Lord Hartwell to witnesses who had testified against Eleanor, dates that showed the money changing hands mere days before certain key figures had come forward with their accusations, and Sebastian's hands trembled as he traced these connections, as the pattern became undeniable. Someone had orchestrated Eleanor's downfall with careful precision, had paid for testimony, and manipulated events to ensure her ruin. And the question that burned in his mind was why, what purpose had been served by destroying an innocent woman's reputation? And then he found the letter tucked among his former fiancée's correspondence. A letter he had overlooked in his initial fury, written in Lord Hartwell's distinctive hand, and outlining a scheme so audacious it made Sebastian's stomach turn. A plot to use Eleanor's disgrace to force Sebastian into a compromising position that would have cost him not just his pride, but his fortune and his standing. And the letter made clear that Eleanor had somehow discovered the plot and had chosen to become its scapegoat, that had accepted the blame for a scandal she did not create in order to prevent the larger disaster that would have destroyed Sebastian completely. And as this realization crashed over him like a cold wave, Sebastian understood with devastating clarity that Eleanor had sacrificed everything to protect him, had endured years of disgrace and isolation, and his own terrible punishment, all because she had loved him enough to save him from enemies he had not even known he had. And he sat in his study as dawn broke over London. The evidence of Eleanor's innocence and his own blindness spread before him, and wept for the first time since his mother's death. Wept for the cruelty he had inflicted on the one person who had tried to save him, wept for the years of suffering she had endured in silence, and when the tears finally stopped, he knew with absolute certainty that he must return to Ashford Manor immediately, must face Eleanor with the truth he had discovered, and beg whatever forgiveness she might grant him, though he feared no forgiveness could ever be sufficient for what he had done. Sebastian spent the following day piecing together the full scope of the conspiracy with the methodical precision of a man building a case that would condemn his own past judgment, and what emerged from the scattered evidence was a picture so clear and so damning that he wondered how he could have been so blind, how pride and wounded vanity had obscured truths that now seemed painfully obvious, for the scheme had been elegant in its cruelty, constructed by Lord Hartwell and Sebastian's former fiancée, Lady Catherine, with the specific intention of manipulating him into a marriage that would have given them control of his substantial fortune through a series of legal maneuvers disguised as settlements and protections, and Eleanor had somehow discovered their plot, had learned through her brother's careless correspondence left unattended in their family home about the trap being laid for Sebastian, and she had made a choice that still staggered him in its selflessness, and had deliberately inserted herself into the scandal at the house party that was meant to compromise. Sebastian, had taken upon herself the blame for impropriety with Lord Weston, a man who had been paid handsomely by Hartwell to play his part, and by becoming the scandalous figure herself, she had deflected attention from the real conspiracy, and had made herself so toxic in society's eyes that when Hartwell tried to push through the arrangement that would have bound Sebastian to Catherine through obligation and manufactured debt, Sebastian had refused out of sheer disgust for anything associated with that terrible season, and thus Eleanor's sacrifice had worked, had saved him from financial and social ruin, though it had cost her everything, her reputation shredded beyond repair, her marriage prospects destroyed, her very name becoming synonymous with deception and impropriety in every drawing-room in London, and the evidence Sebastian had gathered was irrefutable. Bank statements showing Hartwell's payments to witnesses, the letters between Catherine and Hartwell discussing their progress in setting the trap, correspondence from solicitors outlining the legal mechanisms that would have transferred Sebastian's assets had the marriage proceeded, and most devastating of all, a letter from Eleanor herself written to a friend and never sent, found among papers in Catherine's possession after some business dispute, a letter where Eleanor poured out her heart about the choice she had made, confessing that she had loved Sebastian from afar since her debut season, had watched him from across ballrooms with a hopeless devotion she knew could never be returned, and when she had discovered the plot against him, she could not stand by and watch him be destroyed, could not bear the thought of this good man, this honourable duke, who had always treated her with distant kindness during their few interactions, being ruined by her own brother's greed and Catherine's ambition, and so she had chosen to ruin herself instead, had walked knowingly into disgrace because at least then he would be safe. At least then he would remain free and whole even if he never knew what she had done or why. And Sebastian read this letter until the words blurred before his eyes, read Eleanor's confession of love written in her careful hand 3 years ago when she had still possessed hope and innocence, before she had sacrificed both on the altar of his protection and the magnitude of what she had done for him. What she had endured in silence, while he heaped cruelty upon cruelty on her blameless head, shattered something fundamental in his understanding of himself, revealed him to be not the wronged party he had imagined, but the blind fool who had punished his saviour, and guilt crashed over him in waves so powerful he could barely breathe. Guilt mixed with wonder that such love could exist, that Eleanor had loved him enough to destroy herself for his sake, and then married him when commanded to do so by her debt-ridden family, had accepted his coldness and his contempt without ever once defending herself, because to defend herself would have required revealing the conspiracy, and thus revealing that she had known about it, had been involved in events at the house party deliberately, and her silence had been the final protection she could offer him, the last gift of a love he had never deserved. And Sebastian gathered all the evidence with shaking hands, knowing he must return to Ashford Manor immediately, must face Eleanor with the truth he had uncovered, and somehow find words adequate to express his remorse, his gratitude, and the growing certainty that what he felt for her now went far beyond mere guilt or obligation, in that somewhere in these recent weeks of watching her quiet strength and endless grace, he had begun to fall in love with his own wife, though he feared he had realized it far too late. Sebastian departed London before dawn, with the evidence of Eleanor's sacrifice burning in his coat pocket like a brand against his heart, and he drove his horses harder than wisdom permitted, the urgency thrumming through his veins, born of desperate need to reach Ashford Manor, to see Eleanor's face, to somehow begin the impossible task of making amends for cruelties that now seemed monstrous in their blindness, and the journey that had taken 2 days in comfort he completed in scarcely more than one, through sheer force of will, changing horses at every posting inn and barely stopping for sustenance, his mind churning ceaselessly with what he would say to her, how he could possibly articulate the magnitude of his remorse or the wonder that filled him when he thought of what she had done, how she had loved him enough to destroy herself for his protection. And as Ashford Manor finally came into view in the golden light of late afternoon, his heart was hammering so violently he could barely draw breath, and he abandoned his carriage in the drive with barely a word to the startled footman, striding through the house with single-minded purpose, knowing somehow with certainty where he would find her. And indeed Eleanor was in the garden as she so often was these autumn days, kneeling among the chrysanthemums she had planted in late summer, her hands dark with soil and her face peaceful in concentration, utterly unaware of the storm that was about to break over both their lives, and Sebastian stopped at the garden gate, simply watching her for a moment. This woman he had treated with such contempt, this brave soul who had endured his coldness without ever revealing the truth that would have vindicated her, and something in his stillness must have alerted her, because she looked up suddenly, her eyes widening at the sight of him, and he saw confusion flicker across her features at his unexpected return, at whatever expression his face must be wearing, for he could feel emotion cracking through his usual composure, like ice breaking in spring thaw. And Eleanor rose slowly to her feet, brushing soil from her dress with hands that trembled slightly, perhaps sensing that something fundamental had shifted, that the man standing before her was not the cold husband who had left her days ago, but someone altered in essential ways. And Sebastian tried to speak, opened his mouth to form the words he had rehearsed during the frantic journey. But what emerged was only her name, Eleanor, spoken with such raw feeling that she took an involuntary step backward, her hand rising to her throat in a gesture of unconscious protection, and he moved forward then, closing the distance between them with steps that felt both too slow and too hurried, and he could see her searching his face, trying to understand what had changed, what had brought this intensity to his bearing, and he struggled to find words adequate to the moment, and to this woman, who stood before him with garden soil on her hands and questions in her eyes, this woman who had saved him and suffered for it, and never once asked for gratitude or acknowledgement, and what finally came from his lips was inadequate, trembling, but true. "I know," he said, his voice breaking on the simple words. "I know what you did. I know everything. Eleanor, I know the truth." And he watched her face transform, watched comprehension, dawn followed immediately by fear, by something that looked almost like grief, and her composure finally shattered completely as tears began sliding down her cheeks. And Sebastian felt his own eyes burning as he reached for her at last, his hands finding her shoulders, and he understood in that crystalline moment that what he felt was not merely guilt or gratitude, but love, profound and overwhelming, and for this extraordinary woman who had loved him when he was unworthy, and had never stopped loving him, even when he had given her nothing but cruelty in return. Sebastian's hands trembled on Eleanor's shoulders as the words spilled from him in a torrent he could not control, telling her everything he had discovered, the evidence of Hartwell's conspiracy with Catherine, the payments to false witnesses, the legal mechanisms designed to ensnare him, and most devastating of all, the letter she had written but never sent, where she had confessed her love and her reasons for choosing disgrace. And with each revelation, Eleanor's tears flowed harder, her body shaking with the force of emotions too long suppressed, and Sebastian found himself weeping as well, something he had not done since childhood, and the salt tracks on his cheeks, a testament to the enormity of his remorse and his wonder. And when the initial flood of confession finally slowed, he drew her closer, his voice breaking as he said, "Forgive me, Eleanor, God help me, forgive me for the cruelty I have shown you, for every cold word and cutting glance, for punishing you when you had saved me, when you had sacrificed everything for my protection." And Eleanor shook her head against his chest, her words muffled but clear enough. "There is nothing to forgive. You did not know. How could you have known when I could not tell you?" But Sebastian would not accept this absolution so easily, pulling back to look into her tear-stained face with fierce intensity. "I should have seen it, should have recognized your goodness, your gentleness, should have questioned why you never defended yourself, why you accepted my contempt with such quiet dignity." And Eleanor's composure, already fractured, broke completely as she began speaking through her sobs, the truth pouring from her after 3 years of silence. "I loved you even then, Sebastian, loved you from the first season when you danced with me once out of courtesy to my mother, and you were so kind even in your formality, and I treasured that single dance like a foolish girl treasures a flower pressed in a book, and when I found those letters in Richard's study and understood what he and Catherine planned, I could not bear it, could not stand by and watch you be destroyed by their greed when you had done nothing to deserve such treachery." And her voice cracked on the words, but she continued, needing to speak what had been locked inside her heart for so long. "I knew what taking the blame would cost me, knew my reputation would be shattered beyond repair, but I thought at least you would be safe, at least you would remain whole and free, and that seemed a fair exchange for whatever small happiness I might have claimed for myself. and Sebastian felt his heart breaking and reforming simultaneously as he listened to her confession, understanding now the full scope of her sacrifice and the depths of her love. And he cupped her face in his hands with a tenderness that would have seemed impossible to him mere weeks ago. "You loved me when I was unworthy of such devotion, when I had given you no reason for such feeling, and you protected me at cost to yourself. And then when fate bound us together, I repaid your sacrifice with nothing but coldness and cruelty." And his voice dropped to a whisper, thick with emotion. "Eleanor, you are the bravest, most selfless person I have ever known, and I have been so blind, so foolish, and I do not deserve your forgiveness, but I beg for it nonetheless. I beg for the chance to spend the rest of my life trying to become worthy of the gift you gave me, worthy of you." And Eleanor's tears were flowing freely now, but something like hope was dawning in her eyes as she searched his face, and Sebastian pulled her fully into his embrace, holding her as though she were something precious and fragile that he had nearly lost through his own stupidity. And they stood together in the garden as the afternoon light turned golden around them, both weeping, both finally honest, the terrible burden of secrets and misunderstanding lifted at last. And Sebastian felt something fundamental shift in his chest. He felt the walls he had built around his heart after Catherine's betrayal crumbling into dust, and in their place grew something new and terrifying and wonderful. The recognition that what he felt for Eleanor was love, real and profound and entirely different from anything he had known before. A love born not of passion's first bloom, but of witnessing true courage and goodness, of understanding sacrifice and devotion, and he knew in that moment that he would spend whatever time remained to him, proving himself worthy of this extraordinary woman who had loved him enough to ruin herself for his sake. The days that followed the garden confession unfolded with a gentleness that seemed miraculous after so much pain, and Sebastian discovered that courting one's own wife required a delicacy and intentionality he had never employed, even in his youth. For Eleanor had been wounded deeply by his cruelty, and though she had forgiven him, he understood that trust must be rebuilt stone by careful stone. And so he began with small gestures, appearing at breakfast each morning, when previously he had taken his meals in solitude, asking about her plans for the day with genuine interest rather than cold formality, and he noticed how surprise would flicker across her features each time, as though she could not quite believe this transformation was real and lasting. And he persisted, determined to prove through accumulated moments that his change of heart was no temporary sentiment, but a fundamental alteration of his very soul. And flowers began appearing in Eleanor's chambers, not the formal arrangements sent by servants, but smaller bouquets. He gathered himself from the gardens she had restored, roses still damp with morning dew, and late-blooming lavender that filled her rooms with fragrance, and once he found her pressing one of these humble offerings between the pages of a book, and the tenderness in her expression, as she did so, made his heart clench with both joy and renewed remorse for the months he had wasted in blind anger, and their conversations deepened and lengthened, stretching from dinner into the late evening hours as they sat before the library fire, speaking of everything and nothing, of childhood memories and future hopes, of books and philosophy, and the small observations that accumulate into understanding. And Sebastian found himself sharing things he had told no one, the loneliness of his youth after his mother's death, the pressure of ducal responsibilities assumed too young, the way Catherine's betrayal had shattered something fundamental in his ability to trust, and Eleanor listened with such complete attention, such absence of judgment, that he felt pieces of himself that had been frozen beginning to thaw, and she in turn revealed herself slowly, speaking of the isolation of being Richard's sister, of loving their estate even as she recognized her brother's cruelties, of the books that had been her companions through lonely years, and of how she had learned to find peace in gardens and solitude when human connection seemed forever beyond her reach. And as autumn deepened into the first whispers of winter, they walked the grounds together daily, Eleanor showing him the plans she had made for spring plantings, Sebastian listening and offering suggestions and marveling at how natural it felt to stand close to her, their shoulders nearly touching as they examined bare rose bushes, and physical affection crept into their interactions with organic inevitability. A hand at her elbow as they navigated garden paths, his fingers brushing hers as he passed her a book, the way she would straighten his cravat before dinner, with a small smile playing at her lips, and these small touches accumulated into something larger, a current of awareness that ran between them whenever they occupied the same room, and Sebastian found himself watching her constantly, mesmerized by the grace of her movements, the way lamplight caught in her hair, the soft sound of her laughter when something genuinely amused her, and he realized with wonder that he was falling in love with his wife. Not the desperate infatuation he had felt for Catherine, but something deeper and more solid, built on knowledge and respect, and the profound gratitude he felt for her goodness, and Eleanor bloomed under his attention like the gardens she tended, color returning to her cheeks, lightness to her step, and the quiet peace that had characterized her demeanor transformed into something warmer, more radiant, and when their eyes met across the dinner table or in passing through corridors, he could see affection growing there too, tentative but unmistakable, and he understood that they were building something rare and precious, a love between two people who had both known betrayal and loneliness, and were choosing each other consciously, deliberately, with full knowledge of both their flaws and their worth. Winter had settled over England when Sebastian returned to London with Eleanor at his side, and society watched with undisguised curiosity as the Duke and Duchess of Ashford appeared together at events where previously he had attended alone, and the whispers began immediately, speculation about what had changed between them, why the cold Duke now looked at his disgraced wife with such unmistakable tenderness, why she carried herself with new confidence despite the scandal that still clung to her name. And Sebastian endured the gossip with patience born of purpose, for he had come to London with specific intent, and when Lord Hartwell appeared at Lady Pemberton's ball, Sebastian was ready, approaching his former enemy with Eleanor's hand firmly clasped in his own, and he spoke clearly enough for those nearby to hear, asking Hartwell to join him in the card room for a conversation that was long overdue. And Hartwell's face paled slightly, but arrogance kept his spine straight as he agreed, and in the card room with several prominent lords as witnesses, Sebastian produced the evidence he had gathered, the letters proving the conspiracy between Hartwell and Catherine Blackwood, the bank records showing payments to false witnesses, the legal documents outlining the trap that had been set to ruin him financially, and most damning of all, a confession from one of the paid witnesses who had finally broken under Sebastian's investigation and admitted to lying about Eleanor's involvement. And as Sebastian laid out each piece of evidence methodically, watching Hartwell's composure crack and crumble, he felt Eleanor's presence beside him like an anchor, her quiet strength giving him the courage to do what justice demanded, and when he had finished presenting the proof, he looked directly at Hartwell and said in a voice that carried absolute conviction, "You attempted to destroy me, and when your sister discovered your plot, she sacrificed herself to save me, taking blame for a scandal she had no part in creating, and I in my blindness punished her for your sins, but that ends tonight, Lord Hartwell, for I will not allow Eleanor's name to remain tarnished by your treachery another moment." And Hartwell attempted to bluster and deny, but the witnesses had seen the evidence, and their faces reflected shock and disgust, and word spread through the ball like wildfire, guests gathering to hear the revelation, and Sebastian turned to address the assembled crowd, with Eleanor still at his side, her hand trembling slightly in his but her head held high, and he spoke with a clarity that silenced every whisper. "Lady Eleanor Hartwell came to me with a ruined reputation, and I accepted our marriage believing it a punishment we both deserved, but I was wrong, catastrophically wrong, for she is the bravest and most selfless person I have ever known, and what I thought was punishment has become my greatest blessing, my most undeserved fortune." And he raised their joined hands so all could see, his voice roughening with emotion. "I love my wife, have come to love her through witnessing her extraordinary courage and goodness, and I stand before you tonight to declare that any who question her character or spread falsehoods about her past will answer to me personally." And the ballroom had fallen completely silent, and society watching this unprecedented display with wonder, and Eleanor looked up at him, with tears glistening in her eyes, but also with something like joy, and in that moment Sebastian did not care what society thought or whispered, cared only that Eleanor knew publicly and irrevocably that he claimed her not from duty or obligation, but from love, deep and true and entirely willing. And later that night, as they returned to their London residence, Eleanor wept again, but these were tears of relief and happiness, for her name had been restored, and more importantly, the man she loved had chosen her before all the world. Transforming what had begun as punishment into providence, neither of them could have imagined in those cold early days of their marriage. 5 years had passed since that winter night when Sebastian claimed Eleanor before all of society. 5 years that had transformed Ashford Manor from the cold, austere estate it had been into something alive and luminous, and on this particular spring afternoon, the grounds bloomed with more than just Eleanor's carefully tended gardens, for children's laughter rang through corridors that had once known only silence, and Sebastian stood at the drawing-room window watching his wife in the garden below, her hair touched with threads of silver now, but her face more beautiful to him than it had been even in their courtship, for it carried the marks of their shared years, the lines of laughter around her eyes, the contentment that softened her features, and beside her tottered their youngest daughter, barely 3 years old, reaching for flowers while their son, nearly 5, raced ahead with the boundless energy of boyhood, and their eldest, a daughter of 7 with her mother's gentle eyes and her father's dark hair, sat reading beneath the old oak tree where Sebastian had once found Eleanor weeping, and the symmetry of it moved him profoundly, how grief and joy could occupy the same spaces, how what had begun in punishment and bitterness had been transformed through patience and grace into this abundance of life and love. And Eleanor looked up then as though sensing his gaze and smiled, that particular smile she reserved only for him, and he left the window to join her, walking through the house that now felt like home in the truest sense, its walls hung with family portraits and children's drawings, its rooms filled with the comfortable disorder of actual living, and when he reached the garden, Eleanor came to meet him, their youngest daughter immediately demanding to be lifted into his arms, and as he held his child and stood beside his wife watching their family, Sebastian felt gratitude so profound it was almost painful, for he had been given something he had not deserved, a second chance at happiness, with a woman whose courage and selflessness had saved him in ways he was still discovering. And that night, after the children were settled and sleeping, Eleanor and Sebastian walked the grounds together, as had become their custom, speaking quietly of the day's small events, of household matters and future plans. And he told her again that he loved her, would tell her every day for the rest of his life, and still feel the words inadequate to express the depth of his feeling, and she leaned against him in the comfortable intimacy of long partnership, and they stood together beneath stars that had witnessed their entire journey, from that bitter beginning to this profound contentment, and the story of the Duke and Duchess of Ashford became the kind whispered in drawing rooms as evidence that transformation was possible, that love could bloom even in the coldest soil if tended with patience and honesty. And dear listener, perhaps you have found yourself in your own winter season, surrounded by circumstances that feel like punishment, unable to see how spring might ever arrive, but consider this truth that Sebastian and Eleanor learned through their suffering and their healing. What appears to be an ending may be a beginning in disguise. What feels like punishment may contain the seeds of providence, and the people we dismiss or misunderstand may prove to be exactly what our wounded hearts require, for love, true love, is not the passionate infatuation of youth, but the conscious choice to see another's worth, to forgive their flaws and honor their courage, to build something solid and lasting from the broken pieces of past pain. And if you find yourself doubting whether you deserve such grace, whether your own mistakes have placed happiness forever beyond your reach, remember Eleanor's quiet strength, her willingness to forgive the unforgivable, her faith that goodness could emerge from suffering. And remember, too, Sebastian's transformation, how even the coldest heart can thaw when touched by genuine love, how pride can give way to humility, how blindness can be cured by patient seeing. And so, as you prepare for sleep, wherever you may be, whatever burdens you carry, may you rest with the knowledge that redemption is always possible, that love can find you even in your darkest winter, that what seems like an ending may be the beginning of something more beautiful than you dared imagine. May your dreams be peaceful, and your tomorrow filled with small mercies. And if this story has touched your heart, if Sebastian and Eleanor's journey has reminded you of love's transformative power, do subscribe to our channel and share this tale with others who might need reminding that spring always follows winter, that punishment can become providence, and that the greatest love stories are often born from the ashes of our deepest pain. Sleep well, dear listener, and may you wake to gardens blooming.